its own way. Because the Finns are not Slavs, and they don't seriously they don't think about them in the same way. It's a different ball game. Okay, I guess time to be underway. Okay. This is not going to be a lecture class. You need to participate because of what I've got to put up on the screen, and we'll read a little bit, and I want some responses on how it reacts, because part of the challenge of what's going on in sort of Christian nationalism and use of Scripture, our political and common life, this goes back hundreds of years. It's nothing new in one sense, but there's parts of it that are, somewhat more worrisome perhaps than others, but then we've still got people like, Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. So it is a complex topic. It's nothing simple, but right at the moment it seems to be getting a little salience in a variety of parts of the world. So can we have the first slide? We're going to read a little bit. This is about a sermon. So the preacher on Sunday talked about a blood sacrifice washing away people's sins. We know that today many are dying on the fields of internecine warfare, the preacher declared during his sermon. The church is aware that if someone, driven by a sense of duty, the need to fulfill an oath, remains true to his calling and dies in the line of military duty, then he undoubtedly commits an act that is tantamount to a sacrifice. He sacrificed himself for others. And therefore, we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins that a person has committed. Second slide, or the next one. The preacher started his remarks by quoting John 3:16 and noting the divine sacrifice required as part of a divine plan. Jesus gives us the opportunity to understand that if God and his Son gives his human life for the sake of other people, for the sake of the human race, sacrifice is the highest manifestation of a person's love for his neighbors. Sacrifice is the great manifestation of the best human qualities. How does this sound to you? Appropriate, sensible, comprehensible? The whole thing. Sounds pretty orthodox. Yeah. Not quite. Can we go back up one, just so people can see the rest of this? How so? Expand on that a little bit, because I think some people might say, well, sacrifice is, that's what Jesus did, what we're called to do. On our behalf, okay. Okay. Classic theology, absolutely. What about, laying down one's life for another? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Any complications in that we see, or any questions? The parts that give away where this came from. So now, the preacher talked about blood sacrifice. The one providing salvation through sacrifice was the Russian army. We know that today many are dying on the fields of internecine warfare. Patriarch Kirill, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, declared in his sermon on September 25th, just last Sunday. Church is aware that if someone driven by a sense of duty, the need to fulfill an oath, remains true to his calling and dies in the line of military duty, then he undoubtedly commits an act that is tantamount to a sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for others. And then this line about washing away all the sins that a person has committed. One more. So now this is comment from the fellow who wrote this up. Lest there be any misunderstanding about the level of sacrilegiousness offered by the religious leader closely aligned with Vladimir Putin's regime, Kirill started his remarks by quoting John 3:16, noting the divine sacrifice required. And then you've seen this, I guess. Sacrifice, the great manifestation of the best human qualities, Kirill proclaimed before launching right into his comments about soldiers dying. Does this give one any different feeling about the first time through? And if so, how do we think about that? Yeah, please, Rebecca. Because? Mm-hmm.
That's his understanding. So I have to back up a little bit, but I don't agree with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, in what way don't you agree? What's the...
Well, he's justifying going into Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah. But he's also... Yeah. He's also justifying the service of the Russian soldier for the Russian homeland. Yeah, I heard a Latvian foreign minister, I think, last week was quoted with the Russians trying to leave the country to avoid the draft. He said, why should we take them? They're just trying to avoid their civic duty. Now, I don't know whether he's being snarky or what, but you know, if one believes that patriotism is a virtue, you please.
State current Russian war, which we think is immoral,
Right.
could be it's on the U.S. military as well.
Yeah.
Any military.
Any military, yeah.
And the express about that's what the service is. As long as it's for us, it's standing.
Because we're God's country. Yeah.
Anybody else on
Eyes, yeah.
anybody that we might not like doing it,
Yeah.
then it's not.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So how do we work with this? Yeah, please. Yeah, I sanitized the first version, obviously.
Still, overall, I don't think that Jesus was preaching that war is a necessary thing.
Mm-hmm. And yet, how many Christian countries have fought wars over the last 2 millennia?
Well, not just Christian, but I mean,
Well, yes, but we're Christian. We're thinking about what does our faith tell us.
I think even crusades. I mean, you
Yeah.
know, that was. So my first thought was, well, who decides what is right on the war?
Yeah. Arlene, please.
Sacrifice issue.
Okay, so
Receive mode only, apparently, not broadcast mode.
okay, so I've got a question about this sacrifice issue. You've got firemen, you've got wonderful citizens of Florida going into dangerous places, putting themselves at risk to rescue old people and their dogs.
Yeah.
Are they actually doing that because it's going to wash away sins?
Okay.
Or our soldiers, our
let-
military? Okay, go ahead.
Jim, you got to grab the mic, Jim.
They have a mic.
Yeah.
I think the underlying issue for me is the whole doctrine of atonement.
Okay.
I would have totally a different approach to this whole subject of sin.
Sure.
And what arrests sin.
Yeah.
Whether or not it took a Christ to die on a cross to arrest my sin,
Yeah.
or whether it takes me becoming aware of what it is that I'm responsible for
Sure.
and taking action to change.
Yeah.
So the doctrine of atonement troubles me. I could read some of that and nod, but once I got to wash away sin, I'm in trouble.
Yeah, I hear you. Although that, and I get your point on the various doctrines of atonement, but you've got to admit that's one that a lot of Christians would agree with. And then the broader question of sacrificing for others. is sort of hard to argue with as a Christian, value, and virtue. But, who's deciding that? And as you were saying, every country, you generally, there's great quotes on this from all sorts of people, Reinhold Niebuhr and many others, about how, you go in for a concrete purpose. We want this piece of land, or we want this resource, or, we want to punish somebody for something. But at least in a democracy, particularly one that sees itself as a Christian country, you quickly find a good justification for this. This is really for their sake. I'm only thinking of you, in the long run. Yes.
That's what we use as our justification, and it's called just war. And there's a whole theoretical
long
structure that is supposed to make it okay to engage in war.
Yeah, long philosophical and theological discussion as to what violence is acceptable and when and how. And Putin pulled out what would have been seen, at least conceivably, as justifications along that line, denazification. And while that was grossly exaggerated, it was not without some truth behind it. The Azov Battalion was at least a bunch of fascists who, really believe that other nationalities are subhuman, and there's a long stories around that, but we don't need to go there. But please.
It's like what Mark Twain spoke of in his war prayer.
Which was?
And one of the ones was about the prayer when we say protect our soldiers.
Right.
What are we saying about the soldiers on the other side? We're saying protect ours, kill them.
Yeah. One of the most, probably the most moving moment, I'll probably tear up now, when I was in Iraq in the Green Zone. And we were there I was there, I think, Mother's Day, but it doesn't matter. But worship service, and a very earnest, sort of first lieutenant something, a youngish man, but an officer, prayed as we were, doing prayer circle. He said, he told about an Iraqi family on the other side, an opponent. And he said, families on both sides are breaking. And I was really impressed that in a war zone, a man who was there to kill the other side, let's not sugarcoat it, was able, to recognize that families were breaking on both sides. I was impressed. My view of, military Christianity can sometimes be a little hard-nosed. and I thought, boy, there's a depth of faith that recognizes that this isn't just, one side by any means. And of course, that's one of the classic problems is, whenever you say, thank God such and such happened, who suffered on the other side? Are you a Saints fan or a Vikings fan? Somebody's going to lose in this deal. And in more profound parts of life, the same thing happens. Oh. That's okay. Yeah. Other thoughts? This is, to me, at a theological, go ahead, please.
Bill, one thing that I'm not sure I've heard yet in this discussion of what you had up there earlier, that always makes me feel, the stomach clench stuff, is when any kind of warfare is religious led, that it's because of the religion of the people, that it's, a country, Iran, unfortunately comes to mind for me, where it's, it's not that there's all these other political reasons or geographic reasons, but that because we think we believe the right thing and because that's the only reason we're fighting you. I also heard that in there, and that's always been very uncomfortable for me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely in there. Yeah. But what usually happens with wars in any country, you bless them. It becomes, whether you're Japanese and it's in the service of the emperor, who is himself a god figure, descendant of the sun, so forth, or Christian countries. And of course, this has been a pattern, throughout, American history. Can we go to the next slide? Then probably one after that. Okay. And one more. There we go. Now let's flip to a different kind of approach. You've all seen this one. We shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us. Note that present help. I find that an interesting word in there. We shall be made a story and a byword through the world. And story here is not a good word. This is not narrative theology. This is story as in they will gossip about us, obviously. Now, is this familiar to everybody? We've got this as sort of the almost the foundation scripture of American national identity. Everybody, now this is, John Winthrop. This is not actually the Pilgrims. This is Puritans. He came about 10 years later. Does everybody remember who the first English colonists were in what has become the United States and why they came? 1607, Jamestown, and they came for tobacco, specifically. They came to grow tobacco and make money. It was a purely commercial expedition. That was the origins of English ventures in the newly discovered, continent over here. We want to focus on Pilgrim Rock and the Puritans because that's a much more elevated value, but it isn't, in fact, the whole thing. Any reactions on this one? Any thoughts that I?
In the eyes of God.
He definitely does. We shall be a city on a hill. That's the phrase that's sort of become, one of the strongest. That was Reagan's, great phrase. But it was really, as I read this, and I think this was written and spoken to his group of Puritans on the boat as they were, getting here. This was their responsibility to be a good example. You didn't have at that point, for maybe just because you couldn't, they were frail and beset with problems and uncertain about their future. But this was not the world has to look like us. This is, we have to look like we should look when the world looks upon us. Of course, that gradually starts to shift. Next slide, if we can. Okay, here's just a couple of cases. We could go on at great length on all of this, obviously. It's interesting, during the Revolutionary War, I was reading some stuff, this was several years ago, but somebody pointed out if you do sermon analysis back in that era, leaving the Anglicans aside, the rest of the Protestants, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, who else would have been there? That would have been about it back then. Were all preaching from the Old Testament. Oh. The only people preaching the gospel were the Anglicans and the Catholics. And of course, the Anglicans were loyal to England, by and large, not exclusively. But, and the Anabaptists. We had Anabaptists already by then. So the Anabaptists were preaching the gospel. Quakers, yeah, if they preach, but I get your point, yes. They gather. Yes, exactly. So, and they were, again, New Testament, gospel, peace, the life of the Spirit, the divine light in all people. But the Protestants were basically preaching the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is just full of good stuff when you want to beat up the other side and feel good about it. I mean, let's face it. I have a great deal of trouble preaching looking at the Old Testament text anymore. Because I just see how they've been, in my view, used, and I hate to say that because I read, in general, I mean, it's a whole Bible, and Presbyterians have always insisted, Reformed theology has insisted that all Scripture, is valid for teaching and all that. That you can't just cut out part of it like Origen did or like Thomas Jefferson did. But anyway, different topic. But here's just a couple of spots as we, come along. In 1846, a Northern Methodist said that the war was terrible, but prosecuted with an enlightened, humane, and liberal policy of our government, and would bring the great body of the Mexican people under the influence and training of American institutions. So we're only thinking of you. We just want this to be better for you because you will be better off.
We're going to kill you nice.
Yes, exactly, which we did a lot of. Yes, and then, of course, perhaps one of the most famous passages, at least for people who follow these issues, President McKinley, at the time of the Spanish-American War, there was actually a serious debate in this country as to whether we should take over these countries, these lands that we were acquiring from Spain. And so there were pros and cons, and McKinley finally resolved, and there's a praying in the White House. There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace, do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. And this, of course, led to a period of occupation of the Philippines and a guerrilla war that most of us don't know anything about, in which we just slaughtered people. I mean, literally. We dug mass graves and shot people into them to terrify the population in order to try and suppress this uprising, this effort. Because they wanted freedom too. They wanted freedom from the Spaniards and from us. And a similar thing happened, not as violent, in Cuba, where there was a Cuban independence movement already happening, which we got in there and squelched and ran the place for quite a while until we allowed local government, which of course is ultimately behind the Cuban Revolution of '59. Why was there a revolution? Because the country was basically being run by outside forces, and the Cubans were not very happy with that, or many Cubans were not. So we've got this, this history of justifying what we do by finding, biblical grounds on it. Other thoughts or comments, ideas? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That sort of thing. We've been hearing a lot about in this church lately. So. Sure.
Indigenous issues, First Nations. Massively. Yeah. It's tough. We need a talking stick, talking stick ethos here, which is hard for a group to do. What do I got next? This we're suddenly contemporary here at the moment. This is out of an interview with Doug Mastriano, who is running for governor of Pennsylvania. Has anybody followed this or heard much about him? You know. The host asked the former Army officer who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, is Islam compatible with the Constitution? It is not, he answered without hesitation. The Constitution was founded on Christian Judeo ideas, and it's only compatible with that worldview. Doubling down, Mastriano added, guess what? Not all religions are created equal.
Holy cow.
Say that in my
Yes. Get the mic over there. Yeah. We're pointing back to Margie. Margie. No, we have to use it because it doesn't record otherwise.
It's easy for us. I particularly read about this Pennsylvania governor yesterday in the paper, and he's one of the most feared persons right now running for government in all of the USA. But it's easy for us to point the finger at other people and say, oh, look at how terrible they were in their beliefs this way. But then you do have to remember that in the Bible, it did say, go out into the whole world and preach the word of God. And you can understand, even so people went to terrible, terrible lengths to do this, you can understand that they felt like they were doing God's calling.
Exactly.
And I don't think that we have to always just point the fingers at them, but sometimes we end up saying some of these same things. Oh, haven't I been nice to this person in the in the supermarket today, I complimented them, and I wonder if that person ever got a compliment from a white person. So I don't know that we should be pointing our fingers so badly.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's complicated stuff, no question. How do we respond to this idea that not all religions are created equal when Christianity has traditionally made a clear point of going out and sharing the word? And
There, in the Constitution, the First Amendment
yeah,
says
no establishment of religion.
there shall be no, that all religions shall be treated equally
Sure.
by the government.
Right, right.
So at least within that context,
Yep.
you'd have to say, yes, they are. And this fella doesn't know what he's talking about.
But
Except it was assumed that all religions were Christian, because they sure didn't respect the Native Americans.
well, as soon as you respect that, there were already Jews in America at that time, and of course Christianity, not all that long before the settling of the United States, meant Catholicism. It didn't, now we were largely a Protestant country, but that was already a step into more variety of ways of thinking. I mean, there was a time when, it wasn't that Methodists and Presbyterians were not really considered the same religion. It was, if you were a staunch Presbyterian, the Methodists were just in as great a danger of going to hell eternally as were the Native Americans or the Jews or somebody. Yeah, Rebecca, please.
Your comment made me think about the Constitution and how we don't interpret the Constitution in the same way. That's what we're hearing politicians say today. It's like, we're going to use this piece of the Constitution, but we're not going to pay attention to this piece.
Yeah.
Just like with the Bible.
Jim Cook here is, please. So, yeah. Yeah, that's okay.
If we're going into the world with all our hearts open and the gospel, and we find someone who doesn't receive it, and we try our best, and we say the only reason that we can convince you, the only way to take your land and to make it a Christian land is to get rid of you, we have forgotten all of the things that we said we would follow if we said we would follow Jesus.
Yeah.
If we find somebody who doesn't agree with me, we say, are you against me or for me? If you're not against, we're together, whatever. I go all the way back to the Winthrop quote, and I say, we start with the whole problem of, I am a person, and if you give me Ukraine and Russia, I have to make a choice. Mm-hmm. If you make God a person, God has to make a choice. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you personify God, you get yourself into trouble. Whether you call him, her, they, whatever. Yeah. You need to, I think we need to not personify God. Is the ground of our understanding, the creator of our being. But do we plead to a person for something? Yeah. I think not.
I hear you. Many Christians reading through the Old Testament as well as the New would not agree with that. But and how do you then deal with centuries of received understanding by many folk? But that's an interesting theological approach to coping with this. What's the next one? See if I can remember. There, yeah, yes, this guy, the article pointed out, Mastriano is running for statewide office on the same ballot as Dr. Oz, the first Muslim from either party to be nominated for U.S. Senate. So, ostensibly, Mastriano and Oz are in the same party running on the same ticket. But Mastriano doesn't really think Oz has any business being here or being a Muslim. I know, but he sure as heck isn't a cultural Christian, let alone a practicing Christian. Yeah, I mean, I don't think. No, others. Several of the Muslim members of the Senate or of the House, that's where they are practicing. I mean, they're not just cultural Muslims.
He can't be sworn in because he's not a Christian.
Right, exactly.
Whose Bible did he use? I thought that was lovely.
Yeah. Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Yeah. Exactly. But exactly. That's the kind of, but this issue of, we were basically a Christian country at the beginning, if just in terms of, numbers. Although many people will point out that on the one hand, church membership was actually very small in the early days of the country. Most people were not members. England, the source of many of our early colonists, the church had fragmented and fractured in the Reformation and the aftermath, long wars, in England as well as on the continent. Lots of people just didn't go to church. I mean, this was not the 1950s in America, retrojected 300 years back. It was not a church-going country, but the Bible was central because it was about the only book most people ever knew or saw or had. And so when you all know this, whenever you read old, early American literature, it sounds like the King James Version, no matter what they're talking about. They could be writing about farming, and it still sounds, like the King James Version, because that's the language that, was, an educated person was just imbued with that sort of stuff. So it is, in one sense, again, it's complicated. It's true that we are inheritors of a heavily Judeo-Christian intellectual tradition, and the public square has been, dominated by that general approach, but we have established a religion. We've insisted that there's no religious test. You can bet, Abraham Lincoln, arguably the finest theologian America produced in the 19th century, never belonged to a church. We claim him because he sat in a pew with the Presbyterians, but he never actually belonged. Okay. Oh, yes, and here's another thing with 60, this is a very recent poll, I think it was Pew, so in a good quality operation. 61% of Republicans said they favor the United States officially declaring the U.S. to be a Christian nation. I get University of Maryland, sorry. Our new critical issues poll, declaring the United States a Christian nation, is a message that could be broadly embraced by Republicans in the midterms and the 2024 presidential race. About 1 in 5 Americans said the Constitution was divinely inspired. That's a fair number of people. That's like 60 million or so, and I suppose that doesn't even include the kids. So I'm not sure, just what level they're dealing with, though. But did you all catch in one of the January 6th hearings the fellow from Arizona? Who was a member of the state Senate, I think, and staunchly, defended the validity of the vote in Arizona. And he was so upset at the critiques of it and the attacks on it because and he was a Mormon, by the way, he believed that the Constitution was divinely inspired. And that anything that didn't follow it was a violation of his faith, as well as civil order. And I'm not knocking, that was not meant to be an anti-Mormon comment. I can do that at other times. But the Mormons are, a uniquely American, tradition. And so they come at these issues, and yet, of course, they also were persecuted, basically, by fellow Americans and the U.S. government. It's fascinating how we forced the Mormons into a change in their theological doctrine in order for Utah to become a state. They had to get rid of polygamy. The Congress was not prepared to pass making Utah a state when they were not merely was polygamy legal, but it was endorsed by the Mormons. So that's why it was legal. We forced them. They had a new revelation. Which is, when you have the doctrine of continuous revelation, this allows you to solve certain problems and differently than, say, Presbyterians do when you have to run it through general assemblies and committees and so forth. But if the first prophet, has a new revelation, that's it. So a little bit niftier way to do this. Well, you assume that they would still say no. The First Amendment is quite clear that there's no establishment of religion. But we have seen, we have seen already with this current court, changes in their attitudes towards religious practice. The football coach in Washington State, the schools up in Maine, general questions about, and there's a bunch of cases apparently coming up to this current year on the court that will also be around religious practice. Please.
They still seem opposed to the idea of prohibiting the free exercise of religion. I mean, this court agrees with that, but they're kind of wavering on the no establishment.
That's a good. I think that's a very good way to put it. They're being much more permissive on what you can do or what religion can do. Hobby Lobby can refuse to provide health insurance that includes contraception because they're against contraception. The coach can pray in public because he wants to, and he's a Christian, and he gets to do that. But the flip of that sort of, as you just put it, say that again. They're not quite going there. But I mean, if you've got the gay bakery, the gay wedding cake issue, you can pretty well figure out what side that's going to fall on now. Whereas 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been, you're a public conveyance, a public business, you've got to deal with whoever walks in the door. And what's that going to do to pharmacists and physicians on, on Plan B, Plan B pills, let alone getting into medical abortions or surgical abortions. But the Plan B is just sort of the morning after, I guess it's called, the morning after pill. But if I don't believe in extramarital sex, and I don't want to then let this woman have the pill, am I going to be allowed to do that when I'm the only pharmacist, in the middle of North Dakota or something, and there's nobody else to fill it within, 100 miles or whatever? Yeah, please.
I was the Aiken pharmacist, and it was really a couple, and they knew they had unprotected sex, and so she wanted to take it.
Yeah.
And he refused, and she had to go 100 miles away. I mean, It was just, why did the pharmacy allow to have a pharmacist who wouldn't dispense because of that? That's the question I have, is why, he can have his own choice, but don't force it on somebody else.
Yeah, but that's the issue, is how much can you, by, being freed up, so to speak, or being allowed to, conduct your faith as you see fit. So that football coach says, "Oh, this is just voluntary prayer," but all the kids figure, if I don't keep the coach happy, I'm not going to get as much playing time. So, like as I say, 10 years ago, it would have been, no, you don't get to do that because of the risk of invidious, actions towards a person. Now it's, you get to do your religion. What's going to be really interesting is when we get a case that involves, where a Muslim case or even a Jewish case gets front, let alone Hindus or Buddhists or something really, sort of off band. I'm auditing a course at the moment over at United Theological Seminary, the topic, the name of which is, "What is religion?" And this is a more complicated question than it sounds like. And so what gets to be called, a religion? Presumably not football or trout fishing. But after that, it becomes a complicated question as to, cultural religions or religions that are so embedded in a culture that you can't separate them, et cetera, et cetera. Ironic? Right, yes. Yes, exactly. Or get ordained over the internet to do a marriage and so forth. No, exactly. I think I got just maybe one more, I'm not sure. Oh, that's right. Can you go one more? Maybe I messed this up. There we go. And then we'll go back. I got these out of order. Who knows about the 7 Mountain Mandate? Are you aware of this one? I've been doing some reading recently, obviously, on Christian nationalism. And one of the things, this is a thing, the 7 Mountain Mandate is a thing in certain Christian circles these days. Revelations 17, verse 9, "Here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. The 7 areas which the movement believes control society and which they seek to control: family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. Their mission to take over the world is justified by Isaiah 2:2. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains. And the followers believe that by fulfilling the seven mountain mandate, they can bring about the end times, bring about the rapture. This is actively being discussed at meetings, large meetings of people. There are books on this. Part of the reason for founding things like Liberty University out in Virginia, Jerry Falwell's, it has got something like 60,000 students, most of whom are online, obviously. But this is not a small thing. They've got law schools that are working on coming up with justifications. It's kind of like the Federalist Society, which has produced, most of the recent judicial nominees. It's the Federalist Society on steroids, with a much more explicit and conscious goal of getting conservative, religiously conservative of a particular stripe. There are religious conservatives who are thoughtful, caring, mission-minded people. but this stripe of whatever you want to call it is really seeking to get people educated, to then get sort of pushed into these positions and make all of these institutions more in line with their understanding of what it means to be a Christian, which is going to be a pretty narrow understanding, I'm fairly confident.
Bill, so they're saying that the seven mountains are those seven items.
Right, these seven parts of society.
That's what they say.
They are called
from Revelations.
Yep. Now, can we go back one? This is from a fellow who was reporting on a recent conference that he'd been at.
Okay.
One of the conservative political conferences. And he was saying the things that worried him, having somebody who's followed this area for a long time. It's my highlights. First, the rhetoric of violence among movement leaders appeared to have increased significantly from the already alarming levels I had observed in previous years. Second, the theology of dominionism. That's the Seven Mountains mandate and the call to have dominion over the nation. We all know dominion from, Genesis, 1, 2, have dominion over the fish of the sea and all of that. But this takes dominionism into a control of the nation because we are, after all, the new Israel. You got to remember that. That's kind of behind all of this, is this assumption that we are the new Israel. It's a bit, actually parallel to Russia, which is the third Rome. Moscow is the third Rome, and that's part of this Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox sense of a global responsibility. We may think of Protestants in mission, but actually Orthodox have a sense of that also, and they want to, control the region. Yeah.
What was the second Rome?
Constantinople. So, yeah. So you got the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and then when that got taken over by the Muslims, 1453 or something, then the idea of the center of orthodoxy moves to what is the world's largest Orthodox church, which is the Russian.
So I would just have another question that occurs to me. So if these people or whatever think they could control all these different things, the seven mountains or whatever, do you think that's a pretty ambitious goal? Is that possible even?
Well, I would kind of hope
10 different ideas.
You do, but look at what you've got, and not just the Supreme Court, but look at what's happened with a handful of new nominations, and suddenly you have a very different view.
Go back one to the slide.
To the Seven Mountains
To
slide?
the Seven Mountains.
Yeah.
So now we're getting hit with education.
Yep.
Think of what they're doing in Florida and in Texas. They're trying to control education and the story and our history.
Right, trying to get people elected to school boards that will have an impact on curricula and so forth. No, exactly.
It's very difficult in your local election to kind of figure out where these people stand in order to decide where to put your vote.
Yep, it can be very difficult, and people can sound very friendly and rational. I'm just concerned about the quality of my children's education. the way I happen to be concerned about it is, I want a whole bunch of stuff not taught, and I don't want to hear about how we've treated black people or how we've treated the Indians. I want God's history of us. And I mean this somewhat seriously, as the new Israel, as God's chosen people. We are called to have this role. And you get a bunch of this in foreign policy too, with our American hegemony, but that's a bit of another topic. So this fellow was concerned about the rhetoric of violence, the theology of dominionism, the belief that right-thinking Christians have a biblically derived mandate to take control of all aspects of government and society is now, he said, explicitly embraced. It's always been a thought of, Christians should participate in culture. That's a very Presbyterian value. That we should participate in our civic culture. We are part of society. We are not, Anabaptists withdrawing or, we don't want a Catholic view of the church controlling, at least in our Protestant view. But the Protestants should participate in the secular world. But dominionism is not secular. It wants the secular world to run by their version of Christian principles. And then the movement's key strategists were giddy about the legal arsenal that the Supreme Court had laid at their feet as they anticipated the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So this happened shortly before that, but of course we all knew what the opinion was anyway. The point of, is this too optimistic? I'd like to think so, but I'm not sure who thought the Supreme Court would suddenly have 3 new members in a short period of time and really radically flip how they, as somebody, were you saying, how they value amendments. It appears that they just are kind of largely ignoring the 14th, which is very critical in terms of a lot of due process issues. But, that's one of those add-ons, and they don't seem to care much about the add-ons. They're going back to sort of the core text where blacks were 3/5 of the people, person, and women didn't vote, and saying we got to deal with original meanings. So if other folk, including us, don't become aware of this, the possibility of it having more influence than we would think, I doubt a takeover, but I don't know. Crises don't bring out the best in people or nations. And I don't know that we're in a crisis now, but we certainly could be. If something happens in Ukraine with nuclear weapons, what's that going to do to not really safety and war, which is terrible enough, but what that's going to do to political views and a sense of panic and a sense of we need a strong leader, and all the kinds of dynamics that we can see coming out of that, in my view anyway. Do I have anything else, or do we go down to? Oh, yeah. God doesn't bless America. That's not how this works. I'm sorry to break it to you, Bible Belt Christians, but that's just how it is.
Is that you?
No, I pulled it out of something. The next slide. No, okay, you can back up, I guess, there. Yeah, back up, there we go. I know it isn't from your coveted and regularly trotted out John 3:16. God loved the world. God is in the world-loving business, not the America blessing business. So the guy, obviously, who's sort of had it up to here with this particular version. But that's, that's the issue as to what does it mean to be a Christian? Is being a Christian and being an American identical? And so often we take it that way. Several years ago, on Facebook, some church friends, I started my Facebook when I was stated clerk, and was sort of had lots of clergy and church-related friends on it, and somebody put on about how thankful they were to live in a democratic society, couldn't imagine being a Christian otherwise or elsewhere. And I said, well, I'm thankful for that too, but do you realize most of the world's Christians don't live in stable democracies? What do we say to that? And then when I was in Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is 5% Christian. Nobody talks about living in a Christian country there. There is mission, there is sharing the gospel, but it's certainly not at the end of a gun barrel, or with particular, economic power to bring to bear. But there are vibrant churches there that are feeding the poor and helping the hungry and so forth. The church I was pastor there for a while, my interim, has now finally for the first time in its 120-year history, got a Sri Lankan as the pastor. It's been a Scots kirk its whole time. And now they've got a Sri Lankan Reformed guy in as pastor, which I think is kind of neat. But I mean, our sense of ourselves as being a unique, child of God, uniquely, America blessed by God, colors, how all of us think about this and our politics in ways that if anything, are now becoming more acute. Thoughtful Christians participating in the public square has always, been a value and a good thing. But when the thoughtful Christians think that they should run things in accord with a particular interpretation of Scripture, then we start moving into dangerous territory. And yet there's more of this going on out there, folks, than we realize. Because our bubbles are bubbles. And we don't know folk. Most of it don't even know black folk, let alone, lots of other parts of our society. Yeah, Margie. Oh, we are done.
I can remember, this is my 58th Worldwide Communion Sunday at Valley Church. And so I've got a Valley history. And I remember when the question of faith and values and how much do we, when it hit Valley, when children of our members became Moonies.
Sure.
And it was 2 years of Sunday morning discussions on how do we deal with these people,
sure.
And how do the parents deal with their children.
Yeah.
It was a very hard time.
Yeah. There are challenges out there, and they will return. And the Moonies have not gone away, but they're just more influential in Japan than they are here. So, strangely enough. Anyway, there are no simple answers, and I didn't come to give you any. So, but I think it's about time to wrap up, right? It is. So, hope it's been enjoyable, and thank you much for coming. Thank you much.